Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin dominance. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. Bitcoin dominance, as I have said, is the key to unlocking the secrets of the Cryptoverse, at least for the people that are willing to see the theory play out. The theory that I talked about 3 years ago was that Bitcoin dominance would slowly make its way to 60%. And it sure as hell felt like it was never going to get there. At times, it just felt like it was taking forever. But the destination was 60%. And one of the things I've really thought about a lot recently is sort of the topping process of Bitcoin dominance, because normally it's a process. It's not normally just something that when it happens, you know that it happens, and you can, declare as boldly as possible that it has topped. I did say, that 60% was my target. So for my purposes, for what I care about, it's good enough, right? Could it go higher? Yes. And we'll talk about that, right? We'll talk about that. But there does exist a scenario where it already has topped out. And that's why I said, it makes sense to diversify. I even put out a video on ETH Bitcoin bottoming. And has it actually bottomed? I would say the odds are decent. But we'll really dive into that and sort of peel back the layers to see, has it bottomed? What's Bitcoin dominance going to do? Is there a chance that that Bitcoin steals the show again, and alts just bleed back to it one more time? So that's what we're going to talk about. But before we get into all that stuff, I just want to remind people, as I said in the video on 60% dominance, right? I did a whole video on it. For me, it's good enough, right? I don't feel the need for it to go higher in order to really be satisfied with the overall theory. Target has been met. It could theoretically go higher, but it's not something that I feel like is worth squeezing out every last ounce of dominance before some level of diversification. And so the first thing to consider with dominance is why 60% could be the top, right? Why could it be? Not that it has to be, but why could it be? And one of the things that I mentioned was that the general idea was that alt Bitcoin pairs had this bubble where and Bitcoin dominance collapsed, right? And so the general idea was that dominance would essentially return back to the level that it collapsed from, okay? Over here, this was more structural, right? It wasn't a huge bubble or anything like that. But when you get a major collapse like that, where it just goes down and down and down, that is more representative of a bubble. And so that's why I said I thought that Bitcoin dominance would return back to 60%. Beyond that, I said just simply doing what it did last cycle and retracing to the 0.618 fib was a likely outcome by dominance. And that's exactly where it went, the 618 fib. So for me, I don't feel the need to declare that this time is different. I just think that, dominance did what it was always going to do, and that was to go to 60%. Now, if you were on the Bitcoin dominance train, if you're on the Bitcoin heavy train, and you started to diversify the last couple of weeks after dominance hit that 60% milestone, I imagine that you are quite happy right now. Obviously, right? Some of these altcoins are doing quite well. And another thing that I mentioned was that after the second rate cut, we should see dominance drop, right? That was what I said. And the reason, it was not rocket science, right? It was just, hey, after the first rate cut, dominance dropped. So maybe, just maybe, it's not that complicated. Perhaps after the second rate cut, dominance will drop as well. But at this point, and sort of anticipating that drop, and anticipating knowing that the Fed was likely going to be cutting another time over here, and seeing dominance at 60%, it made sense to start to diversify, right? And now you can see the market, the altcoin market has been doing fairly well. But I imagine the question at this point is that the durable top? Is it the actual top or not? For me, it's the top, right? For me, it's the top. It's good enough, is what I mean to say, right? It's good enough. The majority of the Bitcoin dominance rally for this market cycle, I think, is over. But I could be wrong. But for me, it's good enough. Is there a chance it goes higher, right? Is there a chance? And there is, right? There is a chance it could go higher. I will say that if it goes higher, I think the window to do so would be within the next 4 to 6 weeks, right? Within the next 4 to 6 weeks, Bitcoin dominance is gonna, if it's gonna go back up this cycle, I think it's gonna do it very, very soon, right? 4 to 6 weeks. When that happens, and it, more than likely, we will see a bounce by dominance at some point, whether the top is in or not, right? And I think that's the reality everyone has to accept. Even if the top is in, you're likely going to see a bounce at some point, right? It usually doesn't just go straight down after the top. There will be more than likely some form of a bounce to call that top into question, right? And I think that is sort of the next thing to look at and to sort of see this topping process through is what happens when it bounces. Does it actually go to a new cycle high or does it put in a lower high? What's really interesting is that dominance hit 60%, which was the milestone we said for 3 years, and it dropped to 58.5. And it feels like dominance has fallen off a cliff, doesn't it? Right? It feels like that. But the reality is that even though it's dropped so much, it's still an entire, almost, this is 1.5% above the 20-week SMA, right? That's how bullish dominance has been recently. That's how bullish it's been. That even with this drop, it is still very far off of the bull market support band. Normally, when you get drops like that by a metric, and it feels like it's a lot worse than it is, the thing that I like to do is actually go over to these moving averages and actually take a look at the 8-week moving average and see, where is that? And that usually provides some reference point, right, for sort of bounces by dominance. And you can see that it actually has held its 8-week moving average here on this pullback. So the question is, has dominance topped? And if it hasn't topped, how much higher could it even go, right? How much higher could it even go? As an investor, and I will continue to repeat this point because I feel like it can go over some people's heads, right? Some people will sort of listen to these videos and they'll think that, oh, there's a chance that it hasn't topped, and they'll just sit, right? And they'll be like, well, Ben says there's a chance it hasn't topped, and they won't plan for any other outcome. But for me, 60% is good enough. The reason why, though, it makes sense to at least entertain, there's an idea that we should entertain, I think, that there will be likely one more rally by dominance. Whether it leads to a higher high or a lower high, in my opinion, is irrelevant. Because if it's a lower high, then, 60% was the perfect milestone all along. If it's a higher high, I don't think it'll be that much higher than the prior high. It might be something like, what we saw back in, in June of 2021 when Bitcoin dominance first bottomed out. It went up and then it swept that high. I could see something like that happening, but it's not something to bet the family farm on or anything like that. And you can see over there, it actually found support at the 8-week moving average. And then it went back up and swept the high, and then it really started to go down. So one thing to think about is, what does monetary policy tell us? And what does the cyclical view of Bitcoin tell us about Bitcoin dominance? Now, as far as Bitcoin USD goes, the cyclical view continues to be the dominant view, right? Bitcoin continues to follow what it always does. And I'm not saying that it always will, because it probably won't. There will be deviations, but if you look at the year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin in 2024 and compare it to 2020, another halving year, 2016, another halving year, and 2012, another halving year, normally Bitcoin goes up in Q4, right? That's what it normally does. And it's tempting to want to fade it, and there's always a chance that Bitcoin does something different. But as I've said for the last several weeks, it's a dangerous thing to fade until it shows you that something else is happening, right? If Bitcoin were to drop, a hefty amount in a week and get back below sort of that breakout zone, then fine, maybe some other outcome is what actually happens. And we'll be here to talk about that if it does happen, because I can't possibly know. But momentum is great sometimes to sort of ride and hopefully it takes you as high as it possibly can. But the cyclical view is still strong with Bitcoin USD. And I think a lot of people would look at this chart and say, yeah, like it seems pretty strong. In order for it to fall off, there would need to be a reason, right? There would need to be a very compelling reason for it to fall off and to fade the momentum. And, until we see that reason, it's just easy to ride the momentum. So first of all, let's focus on the cyclical view, right? Because the cyclical view still seems okay. And you can also look at the ROI from the low for Bitcoin and see that it is following prior cycle ROI from the low. So if we were to first defer to the cyclical view for Bitcoin dominance, what does it tell us? Well, I think the first thing you have to do is go look at what happened in November of 2020, right? I think it's as simple as that. What happened in November of the last halving year? And what you'll see is that Bitcoin dominance was moving up in October, just like it was moving up this October. And then dominance got a pullback for a couple of weeks, right? You see that? It got a pullback that lasted, 1 to 2 weeks or so. And then it still went up again, right? Now, the structure here is a lot different because over here, dominance was putting in lower highs. Here, it's been putting in higher highs, right? So the structure of this is quite a bit different than it was back in the last cycle. One of the reasons for that is because the last cycle, this rally that dominance had over here was during quantitative easing. This rally over here was during quantitative tightening. You see the difference, right? So if you were to overlay total assets held by the Federal Reserve, the first dominance rally was during quantitative tightening as the Fed was reducing the size of their balance sheet, which is what's still going on right now. So you could argue that we're still in the first top, right? We haven't even begun to set the lower high structure of Bitcoin dominance yet, right? That hasn't even happened yet. And that'll probably happen at some point. My guess is 2025. But that hasn't even happened yet. But that's the monetary policy view, right? We're not even talking about the monetary policy view yet. Well, I guess we are, but we're not supposed to be. If I were to stay on topic, we wouldn't be talking about the monetary policy view right now. We'd still be talking about the cyclical view. The cyclical view says to ignore monetary policy and just look at what it did in Q4 of 2020. In November, dominance dropped for a little bit. It made everyone think that it was over, that the top was in. But it wasn't, right? It somehow went back up again. And the reason it went back up again was because attention turned back to Bitcoin, right? Attention turned back to Bitcoin in December. If you look at year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin dominance, excluding stablecoins, what you'll notice is that in Q4 of halving years, there is a drop sometimes, right? There was a drop in 2020 by dominance, just like there was right here in 2024. But in 2016 and in 2020, dominance did go up during that last month of the year, right? Now, in 2016, it did not set a new yearly high when it went up, right? It didn't even make it to the prior high. in 2020, it did set a new yearly high. So it's really hard to say, right? It's really hard to say what's ultimately going to happen with dominance, but we can at least look at a chart like this and say there is a chance that dominance goes up one last time for the cycle. Now, I'm in the camp that it doesn't really matter at this point. I don't think anyone over here that was fading dominance cared at all when it swept the high for a few weeks and then crashed all the way down like that, right? No one really cared. So, practically speaking, it probably doesn't matter, is the point, right? Practically speaking, it's not something that we should be overly concerned with, right? If there's one more rally by dominance. It's just that from an academic perspective, right? Not from a perspective that should guide your investments, but from an academic perspective, could it go higher? And that's one piece of evidence to suggest that, there's a chance that dominance goes back up again. And then people really start to wonder, where's it actually going to top, right? If 60% is not the top. 60% was a target I put out when dominance was at 38%, right? I can't possibly know for sure where the exact top is. 60% is good enough for me. It's kind of like, ETH Bitcoin at 0.034 is good enough for me. Could it go lower? Yeah, it could. But for me, it's good enough, right? I don't feel the need to continue to try to, find reasons for it to go lower, right? It just seems like it's gone low enough for my purposes. If it goes lower, great, I'll take advantage of that. So one way to visualize this is to look at all Bitcoin pairs, right? Total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. And this is an interesting chart. Now, I've heard a lot of people say, a lot of people are obviously talking about alt season and with dominance at 6%, I think it at least is on the menu. Beforehand, I don't really think it was a likely outcome. It's at least on the menu now. But one interesting thing about this chart is basically just the inverse of Bitcoin dominance, is that when you look at what happened by alt Bitcoin pairs in November of 2020, so the cyclical view, November of 2020, what happened is they rallied up to the 20-week moving average, right? You see that? You see how alt Bitcoin pairs rallied up to the 20-week moving average? They specifically went up to 0.39. 0.39 is where they topped. Now, would you care to guess where alt Bitcoin pairs just went in November of 2024? Right? Any takers? 0.39, right? I mean, look, they just rallied up to 0.39 and they just went above the 20-week moving average, which in 2020, they went just above the 20-week moving average. And so it's interesting that, you have all these people. I've seen some people that, they haven't diversified, right? And they're now freaking out because they're like, well, crap, all these altcoins are really starting to run on their Bitcoin pairs. And like, oh, they missed alt season. I'm like, what chart are you looking at? Look at this chart. Look at this chart. At what point on this chart did alt season occur, right? This is alt season, right? This is alt season. Where on here is alt season? This is the thing, right? It's easy to look at a few alts and say, oh, that's it, right? I missed the boat because I didn't diversify at 6% dominance. But there's also, first of all, there's a reality that there still is a chance that dominance goes high, right? There's still a chance that alt Bitcoin pairs go down again. But my point has always been, after 60%, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter at that point how much higher it goes. The point was to preserve the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio for the last 3 years, so you didn't lose all your money trading altcoins, right? So you weren't stuck with an altcoin near its 2022 lows while Bitcoin's putting in new all-time highs. That was the point of Bitcoin dominance. But as from an academic perspective, I can't just simply say, I can't ignore this, especially considering how the cyclical view for Bitcoin's continuing to unfold. I can't ignore it. And what I see happened over here is that all Bitcoin pairs rallied up to the 20-week moving average at 0.39, and then they absolutely collapsed in December, and they went to a new cycle low. They actually went all the way down to 0.18. I don't think they're going to go to 0.18, right? I don't think that, I mean, my base case is not 0.18, but anything's possible, right? Anything's possible. I'm choosing to, believe right now, as I've said, right? I've always tried to throw the degens a bone, even though they don't want to believe me. I've always said that they're oscillators at best, right? So I would prefer to believe that the low would be no lower than 0.25, right? Rather than 0.18. That's what I would assume. And one reason I would say that is because the 0.18 level occurred during QE, not during QT, right? During QT, all Bitcoin pairs just went down to 0.25. So yeah, like there's a scenario that could play out where all Bitcoin pairs just simply get rejected here at the bull market support band or thereabouts, and then go lower one final time into the end of the year, which is normally when Bitcoin USD, normally when Bitcoin sort of takes the eyes back to it in December, right? December typically is when Bitcoin dominance goes up, at least for the first couple of weeks of December. So the question is, does it lead to a higher high by dominance, or does it lead to a lower high by dominance? If you were to just simply look at alt Bitcoin pairs, it would seem like it likely leads to a higher high by Bitcoin dominance, right? If you just look at this, right? Because I think the argument is, how could alt Bitcoin pairs drop, 27% below their prior low and still not lead to a new high by Bitcoin dominance? Well, one trick, though, is to remember that we're not including all stablecoins here, right? If we were to subtract out another stablecoin, like, say, USDC, you can see that alt Bitcoin pairs already went to 0.32, right? So it's not as far off the final low, potentially, of another 20% drop. So that's one way to look at the market. The other way to look at the market is to say, what's going on with ETH Bitcoin? What's going on with ETH Bitcoin? With ETH Bitcoin, I've said before that it's likely going to bottom between 0.03 to 0.04. That is my best guess, and I've been saying it for 3 years. I put out a video just a few days ago saying I would think there's at least a 50% chance that the bottom is in for ETH Bitcoin. I would say maybe around like 60% is maybe even a little bit higher than that, like somewhere between 60 to 70%. It doesn't have to be in, and I'll give you two reasons why it might not be, but I would say the evidence is starting to pile up, right? The evidence is starting to pile up that either the bottom is in, or if the bottom is not in, it's only slightly lower than the current bottom. The evidence is starting to pile up. And one of the pieces of evidence that I've talked about a lot that maybe I shouldn't put as much faith into, but it's my channel, so I'm going to talk about it at least. And if it's wrong, it's wrong, because there's other pieces of evidence we're going to talk about. But when you look at sort of the devaluation of ETH Bitcoin after it breaks down, historically, in 2016 and in 2019, once ETH Bitcoin got back above its 50-day moving average, the low was in, right? The low was in. In 2019, when it got back above the 50-day moving average, the low was in. Here, you could argue the low is in. If you look at 2016, once it got above the 50-day moving average, the low was in. We didn't know it at the time. We sure as hell didn't know it in 2019, right? But you can see that it came back down and double bottomed in December. So that's where I am right now. Like, it seems like there's a good chance that the low is in for ETH Bitcoin, but there is one thing we have to remember, and that's the exact same thing we looked at with alt Bitcoin pairs. What happened with ETH Bitcoin in November of 2020, right? The last halving year. I know some people say, well, we can't compare this to that, but look, the cyclical view has been working so far, right? And if you look at ETH Bitcoin in November of the halving year, you'll see that it actually had a sizable rally, right? ETH Bitcoin had a nice rally. It rallied up about 27%. How much has it rallied so far in this cycle from this low? About 17%, right? So you can see that it's had a sizable rally. And what happened back then is it rallied up. It even actually went slightly above the 20-week moving average in November. You see that? But somehow, even though it rallied up 27%, right? Which if ETH Bitcoin were to rally 27% this cycle, it would put it right above the 20-week moving average, right? Right above the 20-week moving average, which is where it went last cycle, right? Right above that 20-week moving average. Even though it did that in November, somehow it still put in a lower low in December, right? And what's interesting is when it went lower in December, it went about 14% lower than the prior low. 14% lower than this low right here happens to be 0.03, right around 0.03. Maybe 0.029, but I mean, right around 0.03. Right around 0.03. Why is 0.03 significant? 0.03 to me is significant because for the last 3 years, I've said that my worst case scenario for ETH Bitcoin is 0.03, right? Worst case scenario, 0.03. I don't think it's necessarily the most likely outcome, right? I would prefer for the low to already be in for ETH Bitcoin, to be honest, right? I would say I would rather it just be in. To me, it seems like ETH Bitcoin has paid its dues. But again, I have to look at it from all angles. I can't just look at it the one way I want to look at it to confirm my bias. I have to say, what if it doesn't go up from here only, right? What if it either tops here or if it rallies up to the 20-week moving average, kind of like it's done after the last several big rallies, right? You can see it's rallied. And every single time it felt like the bottom was in to a lot of the degens, right? That dunked on me on Twitter, but it was not in, right? It was not in. And every single time, somehow, it still led to a lower low. So I'm over here wondering, right? Is it possible that it could go to another lower low, right? Is it possible that it could go to 0.03? Anything's possible, right? So Bitcoin dominance is the top end. It's going to depend, I think, on if ETH Bitcoin has bottomed or not, right? That's what I think it depends on. Because this is the way to think about it, right? You might be looking at the chart thinking like, crap, it has to go to a lower low, right? You might be thinking that. And there's a chance you're right? I'm not saying that thought process is completely wrong. One potential reason to keep that in mind is if you look at total assets held by the Federal Reserve, ETH Bitcoin did not bottom last cycle. I don't even know what I clicked on. I didn't click on what I meant to click on. But if you look at total assets here held by the Federal Reserve, ETH Bitcoin last cycle bottomed when QE began, right? When QT ended. That's when ETH Bitcoin bottomed. That hasn't happened yet, unfortunately, right? It hasn't happened yet. And so to say this is the bottom would be to say that this time is different. But there is a counterpoint to all that, right? Not every altcoin or cryptocurrency has to bottom against Bitcoin at the same time, right? There's plenty of examples where they bottom at different times, right? Take Solana, for example, right? If you look at Sol Bitcoin, it found this sort of double bottom structure over here back in, 2020 and 2023, right? I mean, it's not like QT ever ended, but it still bottomed out. So that would be the counterpoint. And if you don't even care about the monetary policy theory anyways, let's just remove it off the chart. If the argument is that it has to go down in December like it normally does, you could argue that fine, maybe it does, but that doesn't necessarily mean it has to lead to a lower low. It could, but there's a chance that it just does what it did over here in 2019, right? Where it rallies up to the 20-week SMA and then comes back down, double bottoms in, say, December or something, or higher low, and then goes up in 2025, right? There's a chance that also happens. So this is what I'm thinking. If ETH Bitcoin, if the low is in, right? If the low is in, then there's a good chance that the top for dominance is already in, right? The top for Bitcoin dominance would already be in if ETH Bitcoin has bottomed. If it has bottomed and alt Bitcoin pairs really do sell off to the range lows, then maybe Bitcoin dominance just barely sweeps the high. Best case scenario for dominance, right, would be to barely sweep the high if ETH Bitcoin has already bottomed. If ETH Bitcoin has not bottomed and we end up getting a scenario like this where ETH Bitcoin sells off one last time before the final bottom, right, the actual low, then dominance would have no choice but to go to a higher high, right? There's just not a way around it, right? You can't have ETH Bitcoin at 0.03 and not have Bitcoin dominance higher than 60%. Technically, you could if somehow all Bitcoin pairs were to miraculously go up to, much higher levels. But the issue with that is that they also got rejected by the bull market support band in 2020, which is exactly where they are right now, right? I think that's kind of the issue here. Is that, and by the way, this level that they've rallied on up to is just below the prior support level, right? And you could argue that it's maybe back testing sort of that trend line right there. They do this a lot, right? Where alt Bitcoin pairs will sort of set some lows, like set a higher low structure. They break down, and then eventually they just go back up and back test it, and then just say, oh, just kidding, right? Suckers thought Bitcoin dominance had topped, and it actually hadn't topped, and then it just goes down again. That's a relevant way to look at the market, right? I feel like you have to look at the market that way too, and say that if they do bleed down to the range lows, it's going to likely be something like this, where it happens very quickly, right? This drop, by the way, by alt Bitcoin pairs in 2020, right? The actual final drop after it sort of did nothing up here for a couple of weeks. I mean, it didn't take very long, right? I mean, the majority of the drop, from say here to here, alt Bitcoin pairs dropped 30% in a little over a week, right? So you know how I was saying earlier, if alt Bitcoin pairs were to drop to the range lows, that it would correspond to another like 20 to 25% drop by alt Bitcoin pairs? That could happen in a week. And if it does happen, it's probably going to happen when people least expect it, right? It's probably going to be like everyone thinks that, it's all, it's all systems go. And then all of a sudden, the altcoins just somehow go to a new low against Bitcoin. And again, I'm not saying it has to happen, but what I am saying is I lived through this in 2020. And I remember watching my alts go up, thinking they had bottomed against Bitcoin. And then somehow in December, Bitcoin stole the show and the altcoins sold off again. And then I was like, never again will I sit here and fade Bitcoin dominance for 3 years. Just stick with the king until it seems like it's topped out. For me, 60% is good enough, right? I feel like if 60% is not the top, I will still look back at this cycle and think I did the right thing by staying Bitcoin heavy for at least until 60%. I cannot blame myself if it goes to 61 or 62 or even all the way up to 65, right? I won't feel bad about that. I will look back and say I did the best I could and I was not willing to, declare that it had to go higher one more time. It wasn't worth the risk. And today, on days like today, where in the last several days when all Bitcoin pairs are screaming higher, who can blame? I mean, why worry about it, right? I mean, all Bitcoin pairs are doing well. And if you are worried about this, I suppose you could always sell your alts back to Bitcoin in hopes that happens. But there's no guarantee that it will. Because the issue with assuming that this has to happen where it goes down to 0.18, this is during QE, remember? We're still in QT. We haven't made that transition from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. One thing I've thought about, though, and I don't really, it's how do we reconcile the QE view, the monetary policy view, and the cyclical view? What if, and this is going to be, maybe it's going to sound crazy, but what if the Fed pivots to QE in December? Right? What happens if they pivot to QE in December? Then you have the start of QE right here in December. And so then the cyclical view and the monetary policy view almost line up, right? They become the same peak for dominance, which is kind of an interesting way to think about it, right? I think sort of the pessimistic view on that is that once QE begins, there is a chance that it doesn't mean what you think it means. And I'll try to explain that, right? There is a chance it doesn't mean what you think. A lot of people think that QE means everything just goes up. And you can't blame them because last cycle, QE, for the most part, did mean everything went up. But there's one thing to remember when you look at total assets held by the Federal Reserve is that when QE began, that's actually when Bitcoin started to falter a little bit, right? So all Bitcoin pairs went up, but Bitcoin USD was actually going down when QE began, right? Bitcoin USD, that was this pattern right here. Now, I think this pattern already played out in 2024, right? This lower high structure, right? I think that pattern, the 2019 pattern, played out already. So I'm not, looking at it and thinking it has to play out the exact same way, but just something to keep in mind. There's a chance that QE returning could mean that alt Bitcoin pairs start to go up, but it doesn't have to mean that alt USD pairs go up, right? It doesn't. So, if you wait for QE to return to diversify, there's a chance that you diversify into alts as their Bitcoin pairs go up, but maybe their USD pairs are going down. And that's not necessarily something that I imagine people will be happy about. Even though the Satoshi valuation of their portfolio might be doing better, if the USD valuation of their portfolio is going down, they're not going to care, right? And I know they're not going to care because I've tried to spend, the last 3 to 4 years up here trying to make people care about Bitcoin dominance and the Satoshi valuation of their portfolio. But the truth is most of them don't care at all. And there's no way I'm going to be able to convince them, right? If I can't convince you over the last 3 years, I'm not going to be able to convince you. So why bother, right? Why try? Why try? So that is the cyclical view, right? That is the cyclical view for Bitcoin. Is that the dominance goes back up in December or something, right? And whether it's a higher high or a lower high will just simply depend on whether ETH Bitcoin has bottomed. At the end of the day, a video like this is going to seem ridiculous in 6 months. Because in 6 months, it's not going to matter, right? At all. It's not going to matter. But in the moment, people are going to think about it, right? They're going to be like, well, is it going to go down again? Are alt Bitcoin pairs going to sell off in December in favor of Bitcoin? Right? And the reality here is that it seems like the most likely outcome following the cyclical view is that Bitcoin goes up, and that's why alt Bitcoin pairs bleed. That's what happens normally in Q4 of halving years, right? Bitcoin goes up, it goes parabolic, which is exactly what it's been doing, and alt Bitcoin pairs go down. And you get sort of a brief pump by alt Bitcoin pairs in mid-November, which is what's happening right now, but then they still go down in December because Bitcoin keeps going up, and people don't want to miss the Bitcoin rally. That's what it ends up coming down to, right? Like if Bitcoin just keeps melting higher and higher and higher, people don't want to miss it, right? So they flee their alts and they go back to Bitcoin. And that's how the altcoins then get sold off again when people think it's not going to happen, right? That's how they go to lower lows again against Bitcoin when everyone already thought the bottom was in for them. That doesn't mean their USD valuations have to go to new lows. It just means that their Bitcoin valuations could theoretically go to new lows. Again, I will remind you, because I think people can forget during a video this long, at this point, I don't think it matters. Dominance at 60% was close enough. And if you start to diversify there, you're already winning more than likely, right? I mean, most of these alts are already doing very, very well. There's a chart I want to show you guys that we have talked about before, but I think it's important to remind you because we followed this for years. Think about how many 2-hour-long Bitcoin dominance videos you heard me talk about, where I said that dominance including stables would go to 60%, and dominance excluding stables would go to 65 at the top of the wedge. That's exactly where they went, right? 65%. I can't have a 3-year theory and when my target is hit, decide to raise the target. I can't. I refuse to do that. I say it's good enough for me. If it goes higher, it goes higher. One thing that it could do is what it did over here, right? Where it like, it sort of sells off to the 8-week SMA, which is exactly where it is right now. Take a look at this. The 8-week moving average. Looks like maybe it's a little bit below the 8-week moving average. But then it could rally back up and potentially sweep the high, right? It's always possible that that happens, where it sweeps the high. I've shown you guys sort of my base cases, and I showed you when it was at 60%. I said option 1 is, if I get a path here, right? Option 1 is to just do something like this, where it drops, goes back up, and then drops, and then drops in 2025, right? That's option 1. That's probably, as good a path as any. Option 2, which could be gut-wrenching for people that value the Satoshi valuation of their portfolio, if they start becoming overly aggressive in altcoins and then Bitcoin starts to run again, is there is a scenario where if alt Bitcoin pairs do sell off to the range lows, right? If they do sell off to the range lows down here, there is a scenario where dominance does something like this, where it goes back up, goes above the wedge, right? Above it. Everyone says that altcoins are never going to come back. And then it just simply collapses in 2025, right? That is also an outcome that is worthwhile to consider, right? And again, it doesn't have to be the most likely one. I'm not saying which one's the most likely, right? I would prefer probably the first option, honestly. But there's also a reality that if this option happens, it would actually likely be a great opportunity, right? It's not something to fear. It's something to say, hey, if that happens, bring it on, right? Bring it on. Like, if that happens, right? I mean, I've said before, like, the higher dominance goes, the longer it has to fall later on in 2025. So people spent 3 years fading dominance to their own detriment, right? I mean, had they been bullish on dominance, right? The longer dominance goes up, the more it can drop in the post-halving year, which is when it always drops, in the post-halving year. So the higher it goes, the better the alt season would theoretically be. So do not fear dominance going higher. Assume it's the most likely outcome in bear market years, right? In midterm years, in pre-halving years, and in halving years. Assume that Bitcoin dominance generally goes higher. And you probably won't be disappointed. Does it sweep the high? Does it put in a lower high? Does it put in a much higher high? I don't know. In 6 months, no one's going to care. But we're here, right? It's a Sunday night, and some altcoins are popping, and people want to know, right? I mean, is that it? Or, could they go lower? One interesting thing that I thought was at least notable is that alt Bitcoin pairs have had this move when you include the higher market cap alts. You see that? They've made that move to the 20-week moving average. But you know what hasn't made the move to the 20-week moving average? Others Bitcoin, lower market cap alts. They haven't. They're still down here. What's going on? Well, if you connect the dots on these, you could argue that they already tagged the trend line. So why are they not at the 20-week moving average? And will they make it there? Well, there's always a chance they will. I mean, momentum is something that is dangerous to fade. But one thing to note is that in 2020, for the cyclical fans, while total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin rallied to the 20-week moving average in November of 2020, others Bitcoin didn't make it back there, right? They got rejected below the 20-week moving average, and they still sold off into the end of the year. So, for me, as I've said, 60% dominance is good enough, but it makes sense to be open-minded. Like, it makes sense to say there could be one more drop by alt Bitcoin pairs to finalize the cycle, the cyclical drop of alts against Bitcoin. There could be one final drop, okay? But I don't think it's a drop to bet the family farm on, right? It's one of those things where you already have a strategy regardless, and if it happens and you deal with it then. It's not I don't think it's the scenario where you go into it saying it has to happen and then you get disappointed if it doesn't happen, right? Because again, there's also a scenario where alt Bitcoin pairs drop, but ETH Bitcoin doesn't drop as much, causing dominance to not go that much higher. One of the reasons I say that, by the way, is not because I'm an ETH maxi. It might sound like that, but one of the reasons I say that is just because alt Bitcoin pairs haven't really dropped that much since since June of 2023, right? They've really only dropped about 14% collectively since June of 2023 to the low, right? I mean, as of now, they've not even dropped that much, but from June of 2023 to the recent low, they dropped about 14%. But ETH Bitcoin, right? If you go look at ETH Bitcoin from June of 2023, right here, it's dropped 43%, right? So to me, again, it feels like ETH has paid its dues more so than the altcoin market has. So that's why I'm not as bearish on ETH Bitcoin as I would be on alt Bitcoin pairs, right? For ETH Bitcoin, there's a compelling case that the bottom is in. If the bottom's not in, then dominance is going to go much higher, right? And that is sort of the that could maybe even be a panic moment for alt Bitcoin pairs, right? If people realize that it hasn't actually topped, right? If Bitcoin dominance hasn't topped, well, how much higher could it theoretically go? But that's where we are, I think, on Bitcoin dominance. And I think the reality is that the cyclical view remains in control until proven otherwise, right? The year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin still tracking what it always does, right? Still tracking what it always does. I like riding the momentum as long as I can, okay? Still tracking what it always does. If it deviates, everything I said could still be true, except it might not happen on a Bitcoin rally, but a Bitcoin dump. That's probably not the most likely outcome at this point, right? I don't know what I would put the odds at. I would say in all my years of investing, the best thing to do is to not fade momentum until it gives you a really good reason to do so. The only way that I could see it not occurring on a Bitcoin rally is if the labor market falls apart in December, right? If the labor market falls apart in December and then there's this like, oh crap moment, like, what are we doing here? People are bidding up altcoins and we're getting negative non-farm payroll. Okay. If you don't know what I'm talking about, if you go over to the Macroverse side of things, which honestly, the macro stuff is not really a great investing strategy over the long haul. But if you were to look at what do I want to look at? Employment levels for total non-farm, the establishment survey last month, it only increased by 12,000, which is really low, right? I mean, that's really low. If you look at month over month, right, I mean, you can see it's getting really close to zero. The issue is that you don't want it going below zero, right? When it goes below zero, nothing good normally happens, right? So you don't really want it to go below zero. So if December non-farm prints a negative number, then it could do everything I said about dominance could still be true, right? That's the great thing about dominance is it's not dependent on Bitcoin USD. That's why you can just stay Bitcoin heavy and get exposure to the upside while minimizing your downside risk in a Bitcoin dominance uptrend. A lot of people mistake my discussions about downside risk as me not holding Bitcoin, but that's not true, right? I own Bitcoin. I'm just an investor that wants to consider the risks at all times. There's the upside risk and the downside risk. The upside risk is that Bitcoin just keeps on melting up into the end of the year, which is what it normally does in the halving year. That's the upside risk. That's why I've had exposure to Bitcoin for a long time. That's why I bought it in late 2022. That's why I converted my alts to Bitcoin in 2022. That's why I converted my ETH to Bitcoin in 2022. Is because I foresaw this Bitcoin dominance rally happening. And there's a good chance that Bitcoin just melts up, right? But if something happens, right? If the market throws us a curveball that we're not expecting, it's going to be because of the labor market, right? Unless there's some other geopolitical thing, but it'd have to be, I think, because of the labor market. Remember, Bitcoin USD was going down while the unemployment rate was going up. If you overlay the unemployment rate, right? Bitcoin USD was going down during this time. And this is a downtrend that we anticipated on this channel. We talked about that downtrend a lot. I said it would take about 6 to 9 months to break through it. And it took 7 to 8 months to break through it. I said 6 to 9. And you can see that as the unemployment rate was going up here aggressively, Bitcoin was putting in lower highs. But as it cooled off, Bitcoin broke out. Now, there's plenty of time between now and December, right? I mean, we have, 3 weeks or so before we're going to get any more labor market data. So whatever it's going to be, it's still kind of a long ways off. A lot can happen by Bitcoin between now and 3 weeks from now, right? It's just that if there is something, it would likely be because of that. So for me, momentum is still the thing in control, right? Momentum is the thing in control. So why fade it unless you're given a reason to? And I don't, so far we haven't seen that reason. Now, of course, if Bitcoin were to drop, and get back below this breakout point here, then sure, right? Something's wrong. And it could happen on a Bitcoin dump. But the most likely outcome, as I said back over here in when November began, when we got the unemployment rate at 4.1%, I said if it comes in below below 4.2, if it's not increasing, as long as it's not increasing, then Bitcoin's likely going to go up. And the reason is because Bitcoin does not need a reason to go up. It needs a reason to go down. So as long as we don't have a reason for it to go down, the general path is for it to go up. So the only way, right, the only real way that dominance, that everything I said plays out on a Bitcoin dump instead of a Bitcoin rally is if the unemployment rate spikes in December, right? If it spikes in December and if non-farm payroll comes in negative, then that could theoretically play out, okay? I'm not asking for it to be your base case. I've already hedged against that idea, right? With Ethereum, I've already started, and I said it a week or two ago that it made sense to start converting back and getting some ETH. As much as history tells me that in the years where ETH Bitcoin breaks down, as much as history tells me that that's when ETH USD gets a drop in December, I can't just go into it thinking it has to happen, because the reality is that in November of the years that ETH Bitcoin broke down, it was never doing this, right? It was never going up 30% in November, right? It was dropping basically this amount in November, right? It was doing this in November. And in 2016, it was doing this in November. But in 2024, it's going up instead. So yeah, I mean, look, as much as the history of the charts would suggest that you still get a December drop in the years that ETH Bitcoin breaks down, I can't hold on to that idea and only that idea, right? I have to start hedging against it. And that was why I've said ETH Bitcoin could be bottoming out. Bitcoin dominance at 60%. And because of that, it's time to hedge, right? It's time to have some ETH in case that view is wrong. And so far, that view is wrong. And I'll tell you guys, and I've said this over and over and over again, it's not about being right or wrong, right? I was right about Bitcoin dominance. I was right about ETH Bitcoin. There's a good chance that the ETH USD going down in December is wrong. But here's the thing about investing. It's not about being right or wrong. It's about making money. Would you rather be right and poor or wrong and rich? I don't know about you guys, but I would rather put my dignity aside and make money than hold on to it and cling to it for dear life and lose money, right? That's where I am. So if Bitcoin USD follows the seasonal view, then ETH does not go home in December, right? It's as simple as that. If it follows the seasonal view, which is what is prevailing right now, it does not go home in December. The only way for ETH USD to go home in December is for somehow the seasonal view to fail. That's the only way. And right now, we're not seeing that. I'm trying to be as open and transparent with you guys as possible. I'm not trying to hide behind any theories and pretend like things aren't happening. I said at 60% dominance, it's time to hedge. It is time to hedge these views. And sure as hell, I mean, it seems like that was the right call. I know I'm going to get crap for the ETH USD stuff, but I'm actively betting against it, right? It's funny. I read these comments and they're like, well, you said ETH was going to go home. I'm like, well, I've been buying ETH. You know, I was buying ETH. I was converting my Bitcoin to ETH at 0.034 and at 0.035, right? I was converting there. So you can make fun of me, but I'm up 20%. I mean, so what? Okay, fine. Take a hit at my dignity if you want, but at the end of the day, it's not about that. It's not about being right or wrong. It's about, are you making money on the trade? And if you are, nothing else matters, right? It doesn't matter exactly how it happened, right? It's matter. Did you make the trade? Did you make money on it? That's the important part. Not about being right or wrong. Here's the thing, guys. I want to put this out there as a just in case, not as the base case. We just spent probably about an hour almost, maybe not quite that long, but around that, talking about the more likely case, right? The base case. If the seasonal view somehow falters, which does not seem like the most likely outcome, and ETH USD does drop in December, and it's just a massive fake out, then it would be a major accumulation opportunity, right? If it happens, right? Those are the major accumulation opportunities. I don't know if it's going to happen. I don't. I just know that when ETH Bitcoin historically is broken down, ETH USD does drop about 70%. That's what it did the last two cycles. 70% drops. And this time it just dropped about 50%. So maybe with the ETFs or something, it's changing the market. That's not entirely off base of an idea, right? It certainly could be. But I do look at that and I wonder. So I'm just putting it out there because, at this point, it certainly seems like the most likely outcome is for Bitcoin to follow the seasonal view and to not follow that view. Okay. But crazier things have happened, right? Crazier things have happened with Bitcoin in the past. And, one of them actually with Bitcoin in the past, which again, the reason why it shouldn't be your base case is because you can't call for drops like this to happen. Pandemic-induced recessions, right? It seems like a crazy thing to bet on. But the one thing to remember is that, sort of the 6 to 9 months, the reason I said 9 months was just in case you get a landing, and after Bitcoin broke out here, it rallied about 25%. I don't know how far it's rallied here. I'm guessing, 20%, 30, I don't even know. 20%, right? It's up 20%. It's hard to say that this is the most likely outcome, right? But if it does pull back into this trend line, then something's probably wrong, right? If you see Bitcoin back below 70K, then something's wrong with the cyclical view. And then it might make sense to say, all right, Ethereum will make that move. But for now, I think the best course of action is to assume that either 60% dominance is the top or it's very close to the top. That's what I would think. And by close, I mean a few percent, right? If alt Bitcoin pairs drop and ETH Bitcoin drops to a new low, then it's going to go above 60%. If alt Bitcoin pairs drop and ETH Bitcoin puts in a higher low, then it might sweep the prior high or put in a slightly lower high, right? That's where I am on that idea. But yeah, I mean, this is where the market is. The seasonal view, the cyclical view still remains intact. Bitcoin is now above 81K. If the market gives us a reason to think something else is going to happen, then I will try to listen. But I think the thing is, at this point for crypto, is the only way the seasonal view doesn't hold is if something else happens in another part of the market, right? If like the S&P starts dropping, that could cause a sell-off in crypto. But as long as the S&P is doing well, right? As long as it's trending up, um, then I think the best course of action is to assume that Bitcoin will also do the same thing, right? That crypto will sort of follow the lead by the S&P. Remember, in Q4 of 2016, Bitcoin went up, right? And also the dollar went up, and also yields went up. I've seen a lot of people say, "Well, you said the dollar was going to go up." I did, and I was right about the dollar going up, right? It's back to 105. Where are all the reply guys now who told me it was going to drop down here? They're silent about it because their altcoins are up. That's okay, right? I mean, in 2016, the dollar rallied, right? The dollar rallied right here in 2016, and Bitcoin still went up. So the dollar is not always inversely correlated to Bitcoin, right? It's not always negatively correlated. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But I think some people sort of look at it and say, well, if you're saying the dollar is going to do this, that means that Bitcoin's got to do that. No, I said that the dollar went up in Q4 2020 or 2016, and so did Bitcoin. And there's a chance that the same thing could happen again. The one thing that I guess I'm sort of looking at with the S&P is, can it continue to rally sort of past this 6,000 milestone, right? If it can keep on, trucking higher here, then I don't see any issues with Bitcoin following suit. The only thing that, and I think I pointed this out before, the only thing is if you look at the S&P divided by M2, the money supply, you can see that sort of the S&P divided by M2 sort of bottomed out in July 96, same bottom as October of 2022, and then it rallied basically to where it is right now before it dropped about 20%. And I'm sure when it dropped 20%, everyone was freaking out, and then after that 20% drop, it then rallied another 50%, which I imagine most people were not counting on, right? So basically from September 98 to February 2000, so a little over a span of a year, the market rallied another 51%. I mean, imagine that, right? Crazy moves in the market back then, right? Crazy moves. And I don't really think it makes the most sense to compare it to the .com era, but I guess if you look at S&P divided by M2, it doesn't look all that different. And if it were to follow the .com era, then the S&P from this level, before it's all said and done, could still go up another 15%. Regardless of whether there's a drop or not, right? Another 15% could be in store. So I would sort of keep an eye on all those things. Those are the things that could potentially derail Bitcoin's rally. But until that, until you get a weekly, a red week for the S&P, why fade the momentum by Bitcoin? Why fade it as long as the S&P is making that move? So look, if by the end of the week, if the S&P is struggling, then maybe it'll be time to reassess. But as long as the S&P is doing okay, then Bitcoin will likely follow suit. And Bitcoin dominance is likely in the topping process. This is either the top or you get one more high, and that'll be the top. That's my best guess, but obviously I can't know for sure. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We do have, by the way, on the Into the Cryptoverse website, for those that are interested in altcoins, we do have a crypto asset filter, which you can go to sort of filter through different cryptocurrencies. So for instance, if you're interested in ETH, you can click on it and then you'll see all the charts that we have for Ethereum, right? Then you can go click on, one of those charts and see what's what with ETH, right? You could go look at ROI from the cycle low for ETH rather than for Bitcoin and sort of compare the last two cycles. You can see that ETH is severely underperforming this cycle. And in fact, it's kind of around this time where ETH USD got a little bit of pullback and then it went up a little bit later on. But I don't really think this lines up at all anymore. It looked like it lined up at one point, but it really fell off. So that's where we are, guys. It's a mouthful, but the website has a lot of great features for those that want to venture out into the altcoin market and sort of see what's going on over there. You can click on any number of these charts and then or any number of these different altcoins and then go find a lot of charts till your heart's content. You can go full degen. on these charts if you want to. But just know that those tools are there for those that want to use them. Again, sale is going on right now. Check out the link in the description below. We will continue to run that sale here. We normally have a sale in November, sort of for the Black Friday sale, I guess. We normally have one in November, so make sure you guys check it out. Lock in the low rate. Thank you guys for tuning in. Subscribe. Give the video a thumbs up. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.